Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to the Mad Mamluks. I'm Mahin and I'm joined by my co-host Sim. On today's show, we welcome a good friend of ours, Rashid Dar. Rashid is a research assistant at a Washington, D.C. based think tank. He has a bachelor's degree from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and then a master's from Columbia University, and he also squeezed in a year for y'all Chicago folks at the Islamic institution, ul-Qasim. So Rashid, thanks for coming on the Mad Mamluks. How's it going?
Good, man. Alhamdulillah. How are you doing?
Alhamdulillah, not too bad. So,
on, man.
Yeah, appreciate it. You're actually a kind of a Chicagoland. You're out in the East Coast right now, right? I know you did Columbia, but you're kind of a local for us Chicago guys, right? Yeah. Tell us a little bit about your background.
I like to say I'm localish because I grew up in Arlington Heights up until the age of 6. I was born near Palatine. Then at the age of 6, my mom got into a master's program at a small university in Kenosha, Wisconsin, right across the border. It's the last stop on the metro train if you're going up. And so I grew up in Kenosha. And then up into, from the age of 6 to 18, I grew up there. And then I went to Madison for college, University of Wisconsin-Madison. And, but I would come to Chicago often. We had some relatives down there, but it was mostly we'd go down to Devon to get halal meat. It was the closest place, and I think it still is the closest place for us to get that stuff.
The pressing question is, are you a Green Bay Packer fan or a Chicago Bear fan?
I'm not a sadist or a masochist, so I'm a Packers fan.
That's my gosh. You lost all of Chicago.
Maybe I could get off the podcast now.
I mean, maybe your ul-Qasim studies will endear you to some folks still. Because, maybe some guys they don't care about. I feel like a lot of people gave up on the Bears already. But then, I don't know if you watched the preseason game. Like, Trubisky had a pretty good game. So people are like, Super Bowl in 2 years. That's something about Bears fans. They get super excited, just a little bit,
it's all or none.
Yeah. All of a sudden, oh man, we're in a Super Bowl. Yeah. But so you grew up in your formative years growing up in Kenosha, Wisconsin. Is that could we assume that's pretty much corn country, white suburbia, where there's no a Muslim there's no Muslim desert, so to speak?
Compared to Chicago, at least in America, most places are Muslim deserts, I think. But with that said, Kenosha definitely, it's not exactly Mecca, but there was a masjid there. Interestingly enough, a good-sized community of Albanians settled in Kenosha a long, long time ago. I think in the late 70s, early 80s. And actually, our imam in Kenosha, he grew up in Albania. He was conscripted into the communist army. Before that, he had gone to Azhar University. He had graduated from there. I believe he had even studied with Al-Albani, which, according to his name, is an Albanian as well. He went to Sheikh Al-Albani, for those of you who don't know, a modern muhaddith. And then he kind of organized Albanians in Kenosha. He got them out of the bars and things like that. There was if any of you have read about the state of the Muslim community under Soviet rule, it was really, really bad, really, really harsh. Soviets did a whole lot to kind of destroy the edifices of Muslims and their religion. Anyway, so he kind of cleaned things up. This is a really cool guy. He told me he would preach Islam secretly on his little boat that he was stationed on while in the Red Army. Anyway, I grew up in this community, but it was still very ethnically, you could say, based community. So the khutbahs were in Albanian. There were a couple of other Dacian Arab families when I was growing up, but it wasn't until several years later where they started doing English khutbahs. My parents are kind of hermits, and I didn't grow up with Muslim friends. It's a long story short. And that was interesting. I didn't grow up with Muslim friends, but, I guess I was a good kid, and I prayed. I've been praying 5 times a day since I was 10 years old or whatever. And I never really, I guess, it was kind of just who I was, growing up because, that's how I was raised. But after 9/11, you start to think more about like, what is this thing that I actually believe in? And maybe I ought to like read what the Quran is all about.
Speaking of 9/11, is 9/11 a, how old were you when 9/11 went down?
I was in 7th grade.
Okay.
And I mean, it's like super cliche now about like Muslims like making 9/11 their like wake up moment or whatever. But for me, I think it was a little bit different insofar as that I was engaged in conversation with people online at the time. So I was 11 years old or so. And I was actually really involved in several message board forums for stupid things like video games and things like that. And
so you're 11 years old, 7th grade? I'm just trying to do the math here. You must have been accelerated or something. Well, I mean, maybe I forgot. Maybe I forget. But, it's funny you mentioned 9/11 as a turning point for Muslims. But for me, I was living in Canada at the time. It was like, yeah, that looks pretty bad. And it's going to suck crossing the border. But I didn't really practice I wasn't like super practicing. You know what I mean? I in that sense, I wasn't like, I didn't have this crisis of like, oh, snaps, what do I believe in? I was like, yeah, these guys are kind of crazy, but it is what it is.
I think my initial impulse was really like, I am a Muslim. It wasn't really like my whole world is questioned, and I'm thinking now that like the Prophet, that the Prophet was a liar or something like that. I didn't jump to those kind of like extreme conclusions. Really, my initial impulse was one of defense, meaning like, oh, these are a bunch of crazy people that did this. I need to kind of set the record straight with all my friends online. And when they came to me with, concerns like, I read that your Quran says this and says that, you kind of have to start looking into this stuff because, I wasn't taught about, the quote unquote so-called like problematic verses or controversial issues and these other sorts of things in Sunday school. And my parents are, very, I guess you could say they're very devoted Muslims, but are they like ulama? No, they're not ulama, right? And so I wasn't learning those sorts of things. And so you kind of had to sit at the feet of Sheikh Google and like figure it out, which is very dangerous, right? And I think that's kind of the next part of the story is because you start Googling things, looking for answers, you start going to the library, checking out books, and you just kind of gravitate towards that, which I think makes you feel better, that can answer the questions that people are lobbing at you, that make you feel like you belong in America, and that Islam is there's no tension between Muslims and the rest of the society, etc. I found myself gravitating towards interpretations of Islam as a result of my impulse to defend Islam. I found myself gravitating towards interpretations that were, I guess, say more liberal in nature, progressive in nature. Even I remember my MySpace profile in high school. We're going way back now, but I remember. I think I maybe I'm remembering it wrong, but I believe like Irshad Manji, a friend requesting me way back in the day because I would spout like, I'd be like joining like progressive Muslim groups or this or that. I thought Reza Aslan was just like a genius. Today I think, well, I won't go there, but I think he's made some statements that call into question his Muslimness and things like that.
Why do you think that was? Why do you think you gravitated towards those kind of people to begin with?
Well, I think for me it was initially it's this idea of defense. It's like, oh, these are crazy people that flew these planes into these towers. So people who seem like they might that believe in similarly crazy things. I want to disavow that. I don't want to associate myself with those kinds of interpretations. And it's not just about violence, right? I think this idea of like crazy people and crazy things, it's an insidious notion insofar as what is crazy is going to be, it begs the question of what is normal, right? And it's because you have to, in order to define what crazy even is, you have to know what quote unquote normal is. And at the time when I was that young, what was normal and what was supposed to be was really defined by my environment and what I was soaking up day in and day out. And that was more or less the norms and conventions and mannerisms of modern Western liberal society, small L liberal society. So that was like the base from which I was making my comparison and judging doctrines and beliefs and groups and sects.
So 9/11 became, in essence, a symbol of intolerance for you. Like, it was a way, anytime people, they're very adherent to their beliefs, you kind of associated, maybe not even actively, but even subconsciously, you kind of associated with a strict extremist version of Islam.
Yeah, I mean, this idea that, I don't know, I can't really point it to one specific instance, but, notions such as like literalism is always bad because literalism is, will lead to extremism, et cetera, et cetera. And I don't know. I mean, I guess I'm trying to think how to phrase this. They're just, I think there are things that we imbibe as part of the civilization and culture that we're a part of that subconsciously inform how we judge phenomena, right? And you have to know what are the first principles from which you are operating. But if you're just like a 7th grade kid, a traumatic event such as 9/11, something that we all remember where we were when those planes hit those towers. Unless you've been properly trained and you've been educated in what your first principles are, you're going to, your basis of comparison will be just what seems normal to you. And what seems normal to you will be the environment that you grew up in. I did not grow up in, like I said, my city was not teeming with Muslims, right?
Right.
So inside the house, yeah, definitely it was like a little Pakistan inside my house. But outside my house, it was just mostly white people that I would go to school with and be friends with. So that's who I was around. And so that was them and their culture. That kind of became the basis from which I made comparisons and tried to understand the world through. And rather than, you could say, a sustained study of what it is that my religion is actually teaching and whether I, on my own terms, felt it made sense to me to follow or not. So I began to gravitate towards authors like the ones I mentioned. And I mean, it was, I guess, in college, things changed for me insofar as rather than being like the only Muslim in town. I mean, I had my younger brother as well, but I now had like an MSA. I had community, and I'm going to get back to this point, inshallah, as we continue this conversation. But I basically had suhbah with other fellow Muslims that I didn't have growing up. I made my first real Muslim friends after the age of 18. And I know it doesn't always work this way, where, suhbah is just some kind of magic bullet. I know Hafab, who grew up all around Muslims, and when they go to college, the last person they want to meet is another Muslim. So I don't mean to do that, but I had the opposite kind of experience where I grew up with like no Muslims at all whatsoever. I go to college and I'm like, oh my God, there are people who with like, funny sounding names like me and et cetera, et cetera. And I should meet them. I should be friends with them. We should talk about the fact that we're both Muslim and we can do things. We can do Muslim things together. Right. And so I got really into MSA. I was elected president by my junior year, also served my senior year as president. And I kind of put my everything into MSA. I made a lot of really good friends, and I just had a lot of these like late night conversations with people, people who are more knowledgeable than me, and I was also blessed to, at the University of Wisconsin at the time, there were a good amount of Muslim professors and community members who were educated and could articulate a traditional understanding of the deen to a young college student who's majoring in the humanities. I majored in international affairs and South Asian and Middle East studies.
Right. Yeah.
And so having
So I was just like, I'm sorry to cut you off, but like your experience, I think, is very similar to my own. I just want to kind of like talk, like there's some themes, especially when you're talking about like the kind of folks you were looking at as far as resources early on when you're trying to grasp your faith. So number one, we talked a little bit, and we talked a little bit about this with our last recent podcast with Dr. Muhammad Gilan, where he's talking about like you every human being, wherever you are subject to some kind of ideology, whether you know it or not, right? And I think part of what we're growing up, the way we grew up was that we grew up with like non-Muslim friends. You're not really thinking about, and you're like everyone's religion, and it's a very pluralistic outlook on religion, right? It's like, yeah, you do that, but you're not thinking about like big picture, like, you know, my religion is the only path to salvation, etc. And people who think that way, that kind of exclusivity, are just the extremists. That's the kind of, you know, narrative. Even amongst people who are consider themselves religious, you know, they have that. Now, granted, Islam has a lot of nuance in how that's approached, but generally speaking, we all, like Orthodox Muslims, believe that our tradition is that path that will lead one is the sole path. Not factoring in other issues of like how the people receive the message, etc., etc. And then you mentioned going to the library. So for me, I'd go to the public library, and those were the books that were available. You're not gonna find like book by Sheikh Hamza Yusuf just sitting in the public library, right? Yeah. You know, it's gonna be Reza Aslan, or the guy I used to always like was and I don't even know if he's problematic, is Dr. Jeffrey Lang. You know, he's the math professor at the University of Kansas.
We actually invited him to our MSA. He's a really nice guy. Really nice guy.
So for me, that was my guy back then. But then as you go into college, but for me growing up, I had Muslim friends, but they weren't practicing. And anyone who looked to be practicing for me growing up, I was like, man, this kid's weird. Or I'd make fun of their beard and stuff. I remember thinking about it now. Like, I have friends today that I remember we were like Sunday school classmates, and I'd see them and they'd have like a t-shirt that said Muhammad on it or something. And I'd be like, man, what's up with that dude's shirt? What's up with his scraggly looking beard? We were like 14, 15 back then, right? Mm-hmm. You know? So for me, that was kind of, it's similar in that sense. I did have Muslim friends, but, MSA and the companionship at MSA is really where I think I embraced the deen, so to speak. So yeah, so you were saying, so you're MSA president for a couple of years. You established the Khilafah in Madison. Then what?
So I had good friends, and I had good friends in Madison, good sahba, good folks, and I also think that I would say that I guess you could split my time in terms of how I approached my faith in college into two phases. I think in the initial phase, it was more of just kind of like getting re-educated, learning things from the ground up, realizing that, maybe some of the ways that my parents taught me to pronounce things in prayer were actually kind of off, and kind of just humbling myself and just like, looking up how to do wudu again and these other sorts of things. And that's something that I got into. There's also the mode of, having suhbah with people, having conversation, listening to their evidences for certain things. I remember, for example, arguing the issue of hijab with some of my friends. And I don't want to make this about hijab because I think these conversations get boring after a while. But at the time, I had thought that, hijab is kind of like an unjust imposition. It just can't be fard. It's not something that we can really expect. And I there's so many objections that I'd come to hold about the issue. And I didn't find the evidence compelling and blah, blah, blah. But it was through conversations with people who were sincere and nice and had patience with me and my ego that I came to, just kind of realize that I was kind of in the wrong. And also just looking inside and realizing that why I was so obstinate on a certain point was really more emotional than sitting down and taking a kind of cold, hard look at the evidences, right? And realizing that it could be that something that may make me uncomfortable initially that shouldn't, how I feel about a certain issue shouldn't factor into how I evaluate the evidence, right? And I should just evaluate it on its own basis of its strength and the claims that it's trying to make for itself. And long story short, I ended up switching my position on that issue and many others like that. And you could say how I approach, I basically went from being a liberal to being more of a traditional conservative when it came to how I approach my Islam. that's, you could say, the first phase in terms of the re-education. It was much more focused on the islah of the mind, right? The rectification of the mind. After that, though,
So, before you go on, we got that question. We get that question from listeners a lot. What do you mean by liberal or conservative? Because, like, if you ask some ulama, they will say that Islam doesn't have liberal or conservative. These aren't like labels that we have within Islam. What does that mean to you?
So I try not to use terms like liberal or conservative. I even try not to use terms like Islamic, because I don't really know what that means. I think it's a term that people use to justify whatever it is that they're trying to say. So environmentalism is Islamic. This bicycle is more Islamic than the other bicycle, or whatever the case may be. Like, people are going to people kind of use that term. There's a lot of politics around that term. So I understand what you're saying. In terms of my specific case, I guess rather than using liberal, I could better use it as, so the word conservative comes from, in English, it comes from the idea of preserving or safeguarding over something. In Arabic, when you translate the word conservative, you usually use the word muhafid, right? Liberal comes from the word liberation, right? The idea that you will liberate the mind from all external impositions that are sitting upon it. You will come to look at things in a new way, in a more honest and open way. And it's also about liberating the individual, right, from strictures that constrain it. So in a sense, liberalism is, I think, very tied to an exaltation of the individual's freedom. And so I guess you could say I went from kind of seeing the individual's freedom to think and act as it wishes, to being less of a concern, because now I was instead of recognizing the right of God upon me and my individual agency. And I was now moving towards a place where I was trying to make my individual choices. I was trying to make my individuality in concordance with what I felt God wanted of me through wahi and the religion that he sent down. And so that is how my individuality started changing. I went more from kind of thinking about myself and how I feel all the time, more about Allah Azza wa Jal and how he feels about these certain things. And how did I ascertain that? I found the best way to ascertain that was to look at the scholarly tradition, and to recognize the value of accumulated tradition, a creationist tradition, whereby, rather than say, let me read the Sihah Sitta, like all the 6 books of hadith, let me memorize the Quran, let me become a muhaddith and a faqih and a mujtahid, basically, until I understand this religion totally. Why should I not stand on the shoulders of those who came before me and did the work, and studied in a way that I can't even imagine. I remember, one of the things that was very, that left me with a very changed impression was actually going into the stacks in the library at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and looking at the classical Arabic section, where you see all these old books that usually PhDs in Islamic studies look at, and you just look at the volumes, right? Just like, if you look at books that Imam al-Dhahabi wrote, you look at the books that Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani wrote, you look at these books from the past, and you think I clearly know nothing about this religion. It was really, that's I think the initial step is to say that you really don't know all that much. People did quite a lot before you, and you kind of have, if you're even going to have any kind of confidence in your conclusions about what this deen says and teaches, you're going to have to take into account the work that was done before you. And because, that made rational sense to me. I didn't feel like it was too Herculean of a task to think that I was going to rederive Islam just so I could understand it and follow it. Rather, I would kind of make the process faster by building upon accumulated tradition, I would also make the process faster by accepting the institution of the Senate and Isnad. The idea that the Prophet taught, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he taught his Sahaba, and then and those Sahaba taught the Tabi'een, and so on and so forth, and then there was an authorization that is handed down over time. And I came to accept that idea as being a real source of truth, and rather than me looking at a proposition and thinking, yes, this is true in my estimation, or no, this is not. I would instead say what I would take. I would definitely like make my own decisions, but they would be tempered by what the tradition is sent down in terms of what has precedence. How do we understand these things? And if I was going to break from precedent in a certain issue, I was going to really need to have a really good reason for doing so. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, no,
I don't know.
I think you've outlined this perfectly.
Yeah.
So,
okay.
Yeah, so basically, if I were to, kind of rephrase it, it's almost like, so you have two ways to look at the religion, right? You have what you would call, what you early alluded to as liberal. I would define it as like maybe progressive. Is that okay? I want to be religious, and I'm gonna take the scripture and I'm gonna try to like think about how I feel, what this means to me, and my personal relationship with God, and completely ignore the fact that I don't know Arabic, I don't have basic fundamental tools to analyze these texts. I don't know the context of the Quranic revelation, etc. A lot of times these people aren't even a lot of times folks like this don't even accept a hadith, right? Not to generalize, but I would say that's very common, because they're like, oh, that's just a human narration and there's human error involved, and they're like, I'll just throw out the baby with the bathwater kind of deal. Versus, realizing that, there is like a tradition here, and I have to follow qualified scholarship to understand the religion. And the ironic thing is that the people who are progressives, and they come from various fields, whatever, they may be engineers or doctors or whatever, they don't approach their other fields the same way. They're not going to just go, they're not just going to like pop open like a physics, some book, and then try to analyze. You're not going to like have a professor who, and I remember someone was telling me that the whole Ijaza system or the Isnad system is essentially a precursor to how, the modern academic system of professed PhDs getting their doctorates, defending their thesis in front of their advisors and all that kind of stuff in a way. So I don't know how accurate it is. I've heard it. It was a nice thing for a Jumu'ah khutbah. Whether it's true or not is another story. But
if people were interested in this specific topic, I would suggest the book "The Rise of Colleges" by George Makdisi, which kind of goes into Muslimism and how it gave rise to the modern institution of the university. And there's a lot of evidence towards that, and Makdisi's book is a fascinating insight into that. Makdisi, I believe, if I'm remembering correctly, was Dr. Jackson's thesis advisor at the University of Pennsylvania. So, it's a very good book. I would check it out. But there's merit to what you're saying. I don't know if I can verify that exact line of information you gave, but there's a lot of literature on this for sure.
Yeah, the same but the dude said something about a thobe, like the jalabiya is similar to like, how the gowns we have back in like on graduation day, it's similar and whatnot. So anyway, so moving along. So at this point, you've pretty much embraced traditional. You went to ul-Qasim after your time at Wisconsin-Madison, right? And then, and I know you entered Columbia, but wanted to talk to you a little bit. So I want to first of all highlight the point that you did have enough awareness to kind of change your viewpoints. I think people do often, but for me, I think a lot of people just get set in their ways. It's just easier. Like, it would have been so much easier for you just to stay progressive and like do whatever you want for the most part, and just have this personal relationship with God. I think.
So for me, I think it was a good sign when I felt uncomfortable. Like when I realized like, hey, like this is different. I'm not accepting it as easily. Maybe that could be I'm basically fighting this initial bias that I had. My proclivities are changing. That whole sort of thing. As I became say more traditional, that feeling became less so and less so, because I was exposing myself more to the tradition and its logic, and I was becoming more convinced by it. But in general, I think it's a good thing to, in measured and careful doses, to expose yourself to levels of uncomfortableness. And now that I kind of find myself in the traditionalist camp, I find myself still reading progressive arguments and liberal arguments, and sometimes they make good points, right? And I have to be able to, see if I can, I think people's relationship will continue to evolve. I pray right now that Allah keeps me in this camp, until I die. But Allah is a turner of hearts, and we ask Him for His guidance in that regard. We can only try, but Allah will ultimately put us on the path. And I think that kind of puts me into the next thing that I wanted to say, was that as I was changing my mind about various things, I kind of felt like my relationship to Islam, to Allah, it was like a very cerebral relationship. I think that's the best word that I can think that I can use to describe it. And I realized that when I heard khutbahs and things like that, people would talk about, that Allah loves you, or He loves His creation, or the Prophet loves his ummah, these other sorts of things, terms having to do with love, right? And feeling and emotion. For me, like, Islam was almost like something that it was something that I like critically analyzed on like a very aqlani, cerebral sort of level. And I didn't feel it, it wasn't coming into me in that same way. I don't know what changed, what clicked. But this idea of like, I guess what occurred to me was that there are things that I loved in life. Like, I loved my parents, I loved certain people, the feeling of love was something that I knew. I wasn't I wasn't a robot. I could feel, and I had emotions, and all that. And I thought to myself that I have these emotions for created objects, which I acknowledge are created beings and other members of creation. And is it not more deserving then that I should have even stronger feelings for the creator behind these objects for whom I have love or hatred? When I meditated on that, and tried to inculcate that understanding into my life, I felt like there were kind of spiritual openings that I began to have that gave my heart a level of itmitnan, a level of, how do you put it, like how do you translate this? I know what it means in Arabic, and I know what I'm trying to say. Itmitnan is the same root from ala bi dhikrillahi tatma'innul qulub. Oh, the heart finds rest. So my heart found a kind of rest, right, in this kind of feeling and this kind of notion after these sorts of spiritual openings that I had in my personal relationship with Allah. And I think after that, things began to be much more settled. My mind and heart felt in harmony.
I know this is very personal, but is it possible for you to give an example of one of these experiences or anything?
Because I think a lot of people are wondering, like, what is that change that what you experienced at least was a change in where your reference point was switched from what your feelings or your liberal positions were, and it clicked, the railroad track kind of switched over, and it started aligning itself with, well, what does Allah and His Messenger want from me,
So I guess in terms of like practical things, I mean, a lot of this stuff is private, but I think, Allah gives people trials and tests and calamities, and part of that is to respond to see. Allah says in the Quran that we will give you tests and trials, and it says, atasbirun, will you have patience with them? I think initially, everyone kind of knows what it means to have patience, right? But it's not just like grinning and bearing it, right? I think a lot of patience too is understanding that you're having patience in the face of the maqadir of Allah, the decreed acts of Allah, and that's something noble and valiant. And you begin to meditate on that, and you begin to realize that even everything you look at in any given moment, all of it is part of the creation, and you think, I remember reading something once that said the dunya is kind of like ice cream. It's really delicious, but it's always melting in front of you. Allah says in the Quran, kullu man alayha fan wa yabqa wajhu rabbika dhil jalali wal ikram, that everything on this world will perish, and only the face of your Lord will remain noble and majestic. And this idea, I think you can understand it and you can repeat it as a type of script. And I think there's a lot of scriptism in our community. People repeat phrases over and over again, and I don't think that they've sufficiently concentrated on them and what exactly they're saying. What are these expressions that they're saying?
It's stuff that they're supposed to say rather than stuff that they've actually understood and given
and imbibe. Yeah, absolutely. And so, I remember, this is just like, I think a pretty simple example, but I remember it was Ramadan. You kind of have this spiritual high in Ramadan. Things are going well. You're fasting. And I remember, reading the verse in Surah Al-Mulk about the birds flying high above you. And I think, it's kind of onomatopoeic, this idea that they use the word, I think it's وَالطَّيْرُ صَافَّاتٍ. I have to look it up, but there's this term صَافَّاتٍ that they're flying above you and they're flapping their wings and Allah calls attention to the birds in the sky. Basically, I'm probably come on, call Allah. I don't know. I'm forgetting exactly the exact verse, but I remember reading this and. This is a very basic point, right? Like birds exist and Allah created all the birds, right? But I remember walking on campus one day and I was just thinking about the imagery of birds and how they're part of Allah's creation. And I saw a flock of birds, and something occurred to my heart at that moment and about how beautiful this whole thing was, that I was being given, that Allah had spoken to me through his book, through his revealed book, and then shown me in real life exactly what he was talking about. And I didn't know that the birds would be crossing my view at that point in time or anything. At the same time, I was thinking about this verse and it had a real effect on me. I remember crying at a flock of birds and I remember thinking, like, what's wrong with me?
Wow.
What's going on? What is happening right now? And, when you have that's what I mean by a kind of a moment of like spiritual insight. We can recite, so many things. We can recite the whole Quran from cover to cover. But I think in those moments, that's when I think Allah hands out, little gifts to his servants. One of my teachers calls these moments candy for babies, because it's, and it's not really, it's not the point of Islam. The point of Islam is not to just feel cool and spiritual all the time. You can think you guys had Maulana Bilal Ali Ansari, on the podcast recently, Hafidhullah. And, something that he taught us once was this idea, I think it's in the Naqshbandi Tariqa, they have this thing where they say, al-istiqama fawq al-kirama, that, uprightness is better than, performing a saintly miracle or, having a nice feeling, And so I'm not trying to say that, Islam is all about like crying at birds and trees and
no, but a lot of
else,
people
right?
can actually go with that, gift that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave you.
Yeah.
And some people can become Cardinals and Eagles and Falcons fans after that. And like, oh, this is a sign. That's what it meant,
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So, it's the ability to recognize that gift that came to you, whether it's in the form of a trial or whether you saw it, you saw a verse in the Quran that you contemplated over and you gave your life more meaning after that,
Mm-hmm.
So,
and I think Allah gives these to everybody. I think the question is, are we paying attention or not at the time He's showing you those signs?
Right, exactly. And you happen to, you're pursuing, you were reciting Surah Al-Mulk, so you were reflecting upon it, and then you come across the bird. And I think it's funny because the whole concept of crying out of spiritual ecstasy is. I think a really fascinating subject in and of itself. And it's something that when I first started reading books about Islam and you would see it, or you would talk about like crying out of the fear of Allah or whatever, these were things that were like, I don't know what this, like, because for me, crying was always something negative growing up. Like, something bad happened to you. And when you try to explain it to, like, I remember I was trying to explain to some coworkers this, and they were like, when you have that experience, you actually, like want that experience. That's something you're like, you kind of, like, crave it in a sense. And you remember exactly what triggers it and whatnot. So, but at the same time, me personally, I think sometimes I would try to recreate it sometimes, and it doesn't always work. But that comes back to listen, we're not at the same time, we're not worshiping the experience. We're worshiping Allah, and these are kind of like you said, like little gems and gifts that He gives us when we're traversing this path.
Yeah, and I think at the end of the day, basically, I think this religion is built on serious study, and it's also built on experience at a certain level, and the idea of voke, for example, of truly tasting what this deen is about. It's a very common phrase, but you can write and you can read a whole lot of books about honey and what it tastes like and all these other sorts of things, but it's never going to be a substitute for actually tasting honey, and that's kind of how I think people should understand studying their religion. Muslims should understand studying their deen, rather. That studying is a serious endeavor that uses the mind, and it should be challenging, and it should be grueling, and it should be a lifelong thing, from the cradle to the grave. It doesn't stop studying, but coupled with that has to be a level of practice. I remember one of my I was talking. He's a really, really great brother. You guys should have him on the show sometime. But is Dr. Awamer Anjum. He's a professor of Islamic studies at the University of Toledo in Ohio. He was a dissertator at the time when I was an undergrad at Madison, and he was one of these guys that he is one of these people that I really look up to, because he's a doctorate in Islamic philosophy and history, but his level of personal practice and devotion, it's just a very big part of his life. And I remember him telling us, we were sitting in the masjid, and he's a big guy. I mean, his books are like published by like Oxford University Press, and he flies around the world and he gives lectures and talks and blah blah blah. And I remember him saying, Rashid, if I could write all of the books in the world, but if I don't wake up for Fajr with Shok, or if I don't wake up for Fajr at all, and the taxi driver who knows next to nothing to me does, then this is all nonsense and for nothing. You know what I mean? That there's more. We human beings are not brains that are like floating in vats. Like we have hearts and we have emotions, and we need to ensure that those two are kept in balance all the time. And also another thing that's really important is the body. We are also physical beings in this dunya, right? In this temporary life, we have physical needs, and that also needs to be kept into consideration. So you have the mind, the body, and the spirit. Once these are all in harmony and in accordance, and once they all have tawfiq, I think that's when you can truly start to fly, and you can start to taste maybe a little bit of what the Prophet and Sahaba tasted, Sure. So that was basically my story. I mean, after that, I felt much more well grounded in terms of my Muslimness, and that's more or less been the case ever since. I think that's where I am right now. I mean, I've continued to study and read and such, but I feel like I'm very confident in what I believe my first principles to be, and what it is I stand for.
Sure,
right? But it didn't come easily.
Yeah. So you now at Columbia, you studied public policy, right?
Right. Yeah, I studied public policy. Technically, I studied. I have a master's in international affairs. I focus on political development and conflict resolution, and a few other things. But those are the main things that I was interested in. Of course, I was interested in religion, but I was also interested in the communal or societal side of the religion, and how religion basically affects politics, and what does that even mean? And obviously, being a Muslim, I was interested in the case of Islam more so than any of the others. So I found myself, even though I was in policy school and taking classes on like wars and militaries and, you know, all these other sorts of things, I would also take elective courses in the Near Eastern Studies department, taking courses on Islamic law, for example, with graduate seminars on Islamic law. And so I kind of found myself wavering in kind of both camps. Even before starting policy school, I thought, you know, maybe I should just do a PhD in Islamic studies, or I should do something like that. But I eventually decided against it for a number of reasons. But really, I wanted to be an actor on the ground. I wanted to be involved in the business of politics while being an observant Muslim, to the best of my ability. And so that's kind of where I found myself studying international affairs. And the other reason I went into international affairs was I felt that the Muslim community today is being and has been for quite some time, external political events have a huge amount of influence on Muslim societies today, and even Muslim communities in the diaspora. And so I wanted to understand what those were about, because clearly Muslims don't really know how to navigate this new political world, given the state that we're in today, you know. And so I felt, you know, we had a lot of doctors and engineers and lawyers, and so I wanted to do something quirky. And, you know, in undergrad, I took Arabic and religious studies courses and courses in international politics, and I continued that in graduate school. And following that, I had a short job working on what's called a Track 2 peace initiative. But we don't need to get into it, but basically I helped do some work to try and resolve the conflict in Syria. May Allah protect the Syrian people. And after that, I got a job at a think tank in Washington, D.C. And I began to do research in the specific department that I work in. It focuses on Islam and its relationship to politics. And so we focus mostly on what's called mainstream Islamism. That's kind of one of the issues that we focus on. Islamism is generally understood amongst Western pundits as like the study of groups like the Muslim Brotherhood or Jamaat-e-Islami and these other kinds of groups. And then we also focus on...
So hold on, how do you feel about like Westerners using this term to define us? Like, what's your take on that? Because that's not a term we came up with. They like kind of imposed it on us in a sense.
Well, I wouldn't say that. I mean, Islamists call themselves Islamists in Arabic, for example. They will say like Nahnu Islamiyun or Islamawiyya. These are like terms that they'll use, right? I think that in terms of what was imposed, was really the idea of human communities, that they should all be ensconced within a Bavarian nation state.
Can you translate that?
Yeah.
Ensconced and verbatim. Like, what was that word?
I'm very sorry. I should be more. I should speak things. So what I'm saying is basically that after colonialism, the states that took over oftentimes mimicked the models of governance and political organization and community that were found in the West. And there's a very complicated story behind that, and it's not like some kind of giant conspiracy. Oftentimes, just out of sheer need, they adopted this to survive. You know, and for technological change came. It was a new world. Modernity, the onset of modernity, is just an incredibly disruptive event in the course of human history. Is something that human beings are still coming to terms with, and Muslims in particular are coming to have had a hard time coming to terms with it. And so, yeah, I guess in terms of Islamism, though, part of the idea of this may be a side point to what I want to talk about, but Islamism is this idea that in the logic of modern states, the idea is that the state creates law and it applies this law equally to all of its citizens, and that informing that law, that the process of the creation of that law will be a human endeavor whether it's through democracy or whether it's through monarchical decree, but basically human beings will write laws, and they will not be informed by any kind of like extra rational source. Where classically prior to this period, I shouldn't have used the term extra rational. They wouldn't be informed by any kind of supra rational source. Basically, anything outside of
it would be outside the human being's intellect. I think that's
I think that's maybe the better way to put it. Where classically there was this idea that, hey, we're all Muslims. We're a Muslim nation across different lands all over the world, but we're still connected in this idea of Ummah or Muslim nation. And we all kind of have a kind of understanding that Allah revealed the Quran to the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, and he gave us wahi, and this wahi informs the sacred law, the Sharia, and that it's part of the ruler's duty to ensure that God's law is followed to the best of its ability, or at the very least, the ruler should ensure that he doesn't make forbidden that which is obligatory, and he shouldn't make obligatory that which is forbidden, on people. That is something that he should basically make it so that Muslims can practice their Islam at all levels, from the level of the individual to the level of the state. That is something that it was kind of taken for granted. Now, over time, this is obviously an ideal. Prior to modernity, Muslims assumed the supremacy of God's law, and they at least paid fealty to it, even if it was just like window dressing, right? And it was something that they was assumed to inform how society was to operate, and it was never something that needed to be debated in a real big way in Muslim society until the onset of modernity, really post post World War I. This obviously, I'm speaking in generalities. I'm sure people can find exceptions here and there, but broadly speaking, this is kind of what I'm talking about. After the creation of modern nation states and the modern political unit under which Muslim countries, Muslim majority countries came about, now you suddenly have this need to be like, yeah, but we're all Muslims, right? And like our constitution should say that we're Muslims, and Islam is kind of how we inform law and reasoning, and maybe we should write lines in the constitution to say nothing should contradict the Sharia and things like that, or maybe we should. And different states had different solutions for this. Iran had one solution, Saudi Arabia had another solution, Pakistan had a solution. How do they incorporate the corpus of Islamic law to rule their specific state in this time and age? Can they even do it? Some Muslim countries, they just said like straight up, like it's just not important to us anymore. At least the government, those in charge, said, and we have like a secular state. Or in many cases, and they embrace this idea of secular rule. And overall, I don't think that that's a sentiment shared by the vast majority of Muslims, even if they aren't very, very practicing. Their Muslim identity is still real, and it's still something that has, if you actually look at polling data, support for the inclusion of some degree of Islamic law is generally supported in many regions all across the Muslim world. So this is an ongoing conversation. How do you do that? Groups like Hizb ut-Tahrir, groups like the Muslim Brotherhood, they basically came about in the absence of a political center for Muslim political agency. And really, the Khilafah and all of its problems and issues, especially at the very end, and really from the beginning, not from the very beginning with the Prophet and the Khilafat of Rashidun, but, in the early period as well, there are many issues with the Khilafah. But the fact that the Khilafah existed made it so that a Muslim engaging in politics kind of had ground to stand on, right? And I'm taking this from Salman Sayyid. He has this book called Recalling the Caliphate, came out very recently. He's a critical theorist, very interesting guy, a practicing Muslim himself. I actually highly recommend this book. I think people should read it. But basically it says that, with the downfall of the caliphate and just the idea that it can't exist anymore and that Muslims are done with it. When a Muslim engages in a political action today, it's kind of scandalous. It is a sort of scandal. Muslims are being expected basically to conform to the notion of like certain things are religious and they're private and they should be individual choices, and certain things are political and politics should not be informed explicitly by a religion. And this comes out of a very Western teleology, a very Western course of intellectual development. And it's just not really, in my opinion, is not really, it's hard to square that circle with our history in terms of Muslim civilization and what that means.
Sure. So are you saying that there's this issue in Muslim? Because I can see that being an issue in like non-Muslim lands, but you're saying this is an issue in current Muslim lands as well?
I mean, I think that there are definitely issues where, like, it depends on the country you're talking about, right? Like in Turkey, up until very recently, if you were a headscarf wearing woman, you were denied public services, the right to like an education in a state institution. You couldn't enter these universities. I just finished reading this great book by Kaya Genç on modern Turkey, and he describes how headscarf wearing women in Turkey, which was where the seat of the caliphate was for hundreds of years, under the Republic of Turkey, headscarf wearing women, when they tried to enter university for the first time at a certain age, this is only in the this is really in the 90s, right?
Right.
Like we all grew up in the 90s, right? These girls would oftentimes be forced into what were called persuasion rooms. Okay, and a persuasion room was an area in which a professor or some kind of state official would come in and basically say, you have to take your scarf off if you're going to go to school here, right? And why are you doing it? It's totally dumb. And it's really a sign of backwardness and we don't accept it here and blah, 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 blah. And they basically subject her to a form of like psychological abuse for hours on end. And if she refused at the end of the day, she would be there would be two doors, and one of the doors would lead into the school. The other door would lead back onto the street. She just wouldn't go to school anymore. You have stories where, girls in Turkey would, in order to avoid being seen as hijabis, they would go to school wearing hoodies all day, right? And people like, oh, she's like a goth or something like that. When they had exams and they had to dress nicely, in this age, you had girls who would wear wigs on exam days because they have this thing where you dress nicely on an exam day. They would wear wigs to cover their hair. And this was ostensibly a Muslim majority country, and so obviously Turkey is its own case and has its own history. But
why is it, why is it wrong? I mean, it seems like it's, the caliphate is like a bad word these days. Like, just because of, of course, ISIS did a whole lot of damage to the word itself, but we have like Linda Sarsour saying jihad now, and why is it that the caliphate is such a bad word that goes beyond jihad? Because it seems like
this is a very fascinating issue. If you actually look, I wrote a small article about this, and I don't know if you guys have like show notes or something, and you can link to it if you're interested. But I wrote it a long time ago, and when I was in graduate school, several years ago now. It was called the other C word, the meaning caliphate, right?
Yeah.
The idea is that this word has really kind of spooked global elites for quite some time, especially in the Western world. As soon as the United States launched its invasion into Iraq in 2003, you had statements in a certain year, I want to say it was like 2005, 2006, as early as that, where you had statements from Blair, Bush, Rumsfeld, all these people who would say, in Iraq right now, there are terrorists who their goal is to create a transnational caliphate, and they want to extend it from Morocco to Southeast Asia. And that is their goal. That's what they're trying to work for. And, when you say it in an ominous tone, it probably sounds ominous, right? But this is just like a political project, right? I think the question we have to ask to ourselves is, what things are glazed over with this kind of sense of trepidation, and what things are just spoken about in a rational manner. What is wrong, right? And the idea is why is this spooky to people is because there's this idea that we live in the modern age where like religion is supposed to have been something that disappeared a long time ago. Yeah. And it's something that humans were supposed to have transcended it. We were supposed to reach the end of history after communism, right? And it's just
theocracy was everyone had thought that it has ended with the downfall of the Ottoman Empire, and now humanity has progressed on towards more secular values, and we're going to keep moving in that direction. Where I think the end game, at least from the liberal sense or liberalism's sense, was going to be that religion will mostly be a cultural identity rather than something that people will be expressing in the streets and in other places.
And this is interesting because this whole notion of like we were past it, at a certain point, it comes out of it is basically in many cases it is Western elites and intellectuals and thought leaders reading a history of Europe and its struggle with religion onto other societies as if they had the same experience. And involved in that process is the category of the word religion and what it means. And the idea is like, basically they think like, okay, there's the difference between Christianity and Islam is that, we believe in Jesus, you guys believe in Allah, we have the Bible, you guys have the Quran, we have the church, you guys have a mosque, and blah, blah, blah. It's basically like, let's play this game of like, just switch the words around, and at the end of the day, you believe in this idea of religion, right? And it's a very cynical, view of looking at what religion even is, right? I mean, for instance, if you look, and it doesn't even take into serious, It doesn't take into serious consideration the various metaphysical systems that underpin different religions from different civilizations in different parts of the world. So if you were to go to, for instance, the Far East and you learn about Buddhism or Hinduism, or you learn about the Shinto religion or these other things, it doesn't translate as easily. There may be, of course, I'm not saying that everything is like, it's like oil and water and there's no similarities. We have similarities as Muslims, especially with our Abrahamic brothers and sisters. But there's this idea that the trauma and the history that the West went through in terms of its relationship with its religion, right, where, the church was oppressive and they had such a stranglehold on society, and they were corrupt, and they controlled the people and manipulated them, and they charged them for indulgences, which are these things like, they would say, you committed a sin. If you want the sin removed from your record, pay us some money, and then we'll like do a blessing or something and get rid of it for you. These ideas. It resulted for the Christian West in the Protestant Reformation, this idea of liberating the individual self from the strictures of organized religion and the church, right? But when it comes to like, especially Sunni Islam, there's not a simple, or we don't have a quote unquote church, right? We have this like very informal institution of the ulama. But is there like some kind of like top-down hierarchical church to speak of in Islam? I not really, Right. So what are we going to reform? What are you even talking about? In fact, in many ways,
the body that did govern the scholars was the caliphate in the past, and we don't have that anymore.
Not really. I mean, I wouldn't say that.
The scholars did report to, like, for example, we know Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal, when he went against the state, and the body of scholars that reported to the state, he was imprisoned, right? So, I mean, we know just from that, because I just use that example because it's a pretty well-known example. We know that there were a lot of scholars who, there were a body and that they acted in accordance with what the government wanted in that time. I think, who was the...
Well, I mean, I don't know. I mean, it depends on what you mean. Like when you say this, the body of scholars reported to the state, I don't think that that's entirely accurate. It's not like they had some kind of organization. They sent a representative and they spoke on behalf of all the scholars. Like,
I'm not saying you couldn't be a scholar in general, but I'm just saying that the state did have a body of scholars that
the state tried to influence scholarly discourse to the best of their ability. This usually meant eventually in the initial period, various caliphs would come in to scholars and say, like, for instance, an Umayyad caliph, I believe, came to Imam Malik and said, I'm going to take your book that you wrote, the Muwatta, and I'm going to implement it as the law of Islam throughout the lands. And that's what I'm going to do. And I'm going to basically ensure that your interpretation takes precedent over all, and we'll just get rid of the others, basically. And he was like, no, I don't want that to happen at all. That's not the point. And I don't want you to enforce these things to the exclusion of other interpretations, right? And he resisted that, and this was also in the era you brought up the mihna of the Inquisition of Imam Ahmad Hanbal, rahimahullah, who this idea was like, hey, at the time, the Mu'tazili school of Aqidah had grown ascendant, and had fallen in, it was popular with the caliph's court at the time. And so you had Mu'tazilis basically influencing the caliphal court, and they wanted to basically outlaw anything that wasn't in conformance with Mu'tazili Aqidah and doctrine. And so this centered around the idea of, is the Quran created or uncreated? The exact contours of that debate might be outside of this discussion right now. But basically, the traditional position is that the Quran is an uncreated object because it's the speech of Allah. The speech of Allah does not have a beginning or an end. It just always was. It's an attribute of His. So the Quran, in a sense, always existed. It was just revealed in a certain time and place to human beings. But it wasn't like it didn't exist and then Allah created it for human beings. Like, He spoke. Because if He did that, that implies that God changes, right? And so this was the thing that traditionalists are trying to avoid, because it gets rid of Allah's tanzih, right, of Him being transcendent above change and perfection, transcendent, and that He was perfect,
right. But the point was that there are scholars who were part of the government, like even just the court system, right? For example, the qadi of a judge in the traditional sense in the Muslim history, we know that he was a graduate of a university, like Azhar or whatever, and he would be even appointed as a judge.
I was going to bring this up. With the court system, is that it was seen as something that you just had to do as a scholar. It was a fard kifaya. Certain scholars had to be judges because society needed to function, and the law of Islam, and people needed to be able to, you needed to have an official who could interpret what Islam meant for certain cases, and then the state needed to accept that interpretation and then enforce its application, right? So it need to enforce contracts or property law or family law or penal law, whatever the case is, right? You need to enforce that. So you need to have the institution of qada, right, of judgeship, right? And so, but in the initial period, you had people who are like, yeah, I'll serve as a state judge, but I'm not going to go to a courthouse. I'm not going to wear fancy robes. There was this idea that the state was something that you dealt with because it was like, but you really didn't want to have to deal with it. And in Muslim society, it was interesting because at least in the initial period, it tried to resist the administrative state, to use Steve Bannon's term, right? Yeah. They tried to resist the idea of a state that would have utter control over what Islam meant. And so Ahmad ibn Hanbal's stance in the Mihna was really a turning point for Muslims, where he said, I'm not going to allow the executive branch of the caliphate, which was represented by the caliphate. I'm not going to allow the executive of the state to decide what Islam means and doesn't mean. That is the purview of the ulama, and I want that to remain the purview of the ulama. I'm not going to be strong-armed into changing the position there, right? It's very, you bring up this story. I don't know, you don't have to introduce this, but there's a very cool story of where when he was tortured, Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal, quite often. And he had a Mu'tazili scholar in his employment, and his name was Ibn Abi Du'ad, and he was the Mu'tazili scholar of the Khalifa Mu'tasim's court.
Right.
And he came to Imam Ahmad, and he said, as he was being tortured, and I think he was being whipped, and he said, Ya Ahmad, just whisper in my ear that the Quran is created, so that I might save you from the caliph's punishment. And Imam Ibn Hanbal retorted, and he said, Ya Ibn Abi Duwad, just whisper in my ear that the Quran is the uncreated speech of God, so that you might be spared from the punishment of the Almighty. Right? And there's there's this really different idea that there's this idea that we need to keep the kalimatullah al-ulya. We need to keep the word of God in the highest position, transcendent. It needs to be at the top of the social pyramid in how we understand things. What the caliph says shouldn't replace. The caliph is not God, right? And in fact, what the actual title of the caliph was like the subject of this is Awaimer Anjum, my friend that I mentioned to you earlier in the podcast. Like I said, a very good brother. Wrote, you should check his book out for this, which is called Politics in Medieval Muslim Thought. The Tamimi.
How do you spell his first name?
Ovamir. He talks about how people, the debate over what was the full title of the office of the caliph. Was it Khalifatullah, the caliph of Allah? Was it Khalifatul Rasulillah, or was it the successor to the caliph, successor of the Prophet of God? And you have instances of people that go up to the caliph and say, Ya Ajir al-Mu'mineen, rather than Amir al-Mu'mineen, right? Meaning, employee of the believers, rather than commander of the believers.
Right.
This idea that, hey, you work for us, you work for the ummah, right? And your job is to facilitate the execution of a well-ran state, and also the execution of Allah's dictates in the world where the state has purview over that, right? And needs to enforce certain things, whether it's in contracts or otherwise, right? And so. We came a long way from talking about what does Islamism mean, but in general, I gave this whole kind of tirade to show in the fact that Western Europe and Christendom went through they ran from the church and the institution of the church to the state.
Yeah.
And they built that out, and they ran away from their religion, largely speaking, at least how it was classically understood, and they ran into the arms of the state. Muslims had, in many ways, had almost the opposite experience, where they ran from the state and they opposed the state, the office of the caliph, and they ran to the scholarly class of the ulama. So today, if you're an average Muslim who's even somewhat knowledgeable about your religion, you don't even have to be that knowledgeable. But most people can barely remember the names of 6 or 7 khulafa after the rightly guided caliphs, right? Probably. I mean, you would be hard pressed, unless you're like a dork about Muslim history.
Yeah.
You probably don't really know their names even. They've been almost forgotten by the ummah, almost entirely, right? And what they did, and no one really cares.
Yeah, I got a funny story for you, Rashid. So I have a friend
yeah.
of mine. He told me that so I texted him a screenshot of, this is a side tangent, I'll make sure we get back on topic. I screenshotted, I'm reading this commentary on the Qasida Burda, right?
Yeah.
Right? So this dude, he hits me back, he's like, yo, I read that has shirk in it. But then, he also has no idea who Umar ibn Abdulaziz is.
Wow.
You know what I'm saying? I was like, so, you don't know Umar, Qasida Burda's got shirk in it, but Umar ibn Abdulaziz,
it goes back to what we were talking about earlier, things that you're supposed to say, and then things that you've actually given thought to and had deep reflection on a lot of the stuff you actually say.
Right, exactly.
Total idiot. That's all I care about.
I want to ask you a question again from a layman's perspective. So
Sure.
I'm a layman when it comes to the political landscape and stuff. So for me, I'm like, okay, doesn't Saudi Arabia? Okay, I know it's not easy for everyone to go to Saudi Arabia, but doesn't Saudi Arabia have a kind of a model for like they have the permanent committee of scholars? They have judges that rule by Sharia in some ways. They're probably not implementing everything, but at the end of the day, was the caliphate implementing every single thing? And people are going to get.
Here's a simple response, and I think Russia would agree. There's a lot of foundational elements within the kingdom that would probably disqualify it from even being remotely called a caliphate. I think there's economic policies, like, for example, having an interest-based economy, having a monarchy in itself be completely opposed. That belief itself is completely opposed to what Islam teaches us.
I thought monarchy was part of the hadith of Prophet ﷺ after the Caliph al-Rashidin, right? Wasn't Muawiyah considered a monarch?
That was just saying that these are the events that will transpire. That wasn't a command on.
No, but I guess my point is why
after that it said it'll be an oppressive kingship. Yeah. It's not commanding the rulers to be an oppressive king.
But that's still considered a caliphate, though, right? The oppressive kingship, isn't it?
Yeah. It was still considered a caliphate in terms of the actual framework, right? The framework is there, but that doesn't mean that it's being actually implemented in the way the Prophet ﷺ and the rightly guided caliphs actually implemented it. It wasn't the model institution that it was supposed to be.
Yeah.
Let me ask you about the work that you're doing with a think tank in general. What type of engagement are you providing for Muslims by working with a think tank that's purportedly trying to understand Muslims a lot better, right? And they're trying to inform policies that might be or may not be for the benefit of Muslims. How do you reconcile your work over there and try to see? Well, I hope I'm doing some work that's positive for
I think one of the things about think tanks in Washington is that more or less, you're not going to really have a think tank in Washington that's not trying to look out for the national interests of America, at least in terms of their mission statement. And, whether it's the America First Institute or all these like Nazi type organizations, or whether it's like a communist type think tank or something like that, or something in the middle, which is kind of where I work. They all think that they're doing the best thing for the American state. They're not really looking at, the welfare of in their mission statement is not really to look out for what's best for China or something like this. They have separate centers for that. I'm sure China has its own think tanks or something. But in general, the underlying kind of understanding is that, hey, we're all trying to we're trying to put forward different visions of how America can better conduct itself. That said, the think tank occupies an interesting space, which is kind of between academia and between, you could say, common conversation and public discourse. In a sense, think tankers translate academic ideas and policies, academic ideas and recommendations that are coming out of maybe universities and very dense books and things like that, and they put them into actionable policy recommendations, and they debate those actionable policy recommendations many times in the public sphere, sometimes within private roundtables that we might hold, or sometimes they'll advise the government when they're asked to. Look, for instance, if you read like an op-ed in the New York Times that advocates for a certain policy towards a certain country, oftentimes it is in America that it'll be a think tank person that wrote that report. Yeah. And they're trying to influence the public discourse through the institution that is a think tank. And so there's this creation of the experts industry. For more on this, I would suggest people check out Daniel Dresner's new book, The Ideas Industry. And in a sense, think tanks are, just my experience having worked in one, people are doing real academic work. But at the same time, I think everyone is pushing a certain, you could say, take or angle or agenda or whatever the case might be. You might be at a center-left think tank, so your ideas, you may be trying to speak to Democratic Party operatives and leaders, try and influence how they see things and maybe change their party platform. Or you might be anticipating that your guy might become president in the next election, and so you're trying to jockey and position yourself as the expert in a certain issue so that when your guy comes to power, you're plucked from the think tank and put into the administration. Oftentimes, this is just kind of how things go in DC in terms of positioning.
In your estimation, do you think the think tanks are actually trying to understand the correct reality of Muslims in America? Are they, trying to paint Muslims in a certain way? I know you alluded to there's people who are center left, and they come from all kinds of different backgrounds. But in your estimation, do you feel like think tanks are actually trying to get a correct reality of Muslims, or are they trying to paint them Muslims as in whatever favor they want to, in whatever light they want to?
This again, like I said, is a loaded question, or I didn't say this. This is a type of loaded question, right? Insofar as like the correct understanding of what Muslims and Islam are really depends on the kind of person you are and the principles by which you approach life. If, like, just in the conversation we had earlier, I talked about how I changed the foundational principles of how I view my life. I believe that the correct understanding of Muslims and Islam is that Islam is a revealed religion that comes from above the arsh of Allah, that came down upon the heart of the Prophet ﷺ, and that this is the reality, and this is, you could say, the last bus home. It provides the means for salvation. It is something that human beings should accept if they want to attain eternal felicity in the next life. That's my correct understanding of Islam, yeah? And that's what we believe as Muslims, But is that going to appear in the next, like, think tank publication? Probably not, yeah? It's not going to be, but we shouldn't expect that. Right?
No, of
because
course not.
That isn't.
No, of course not. But there's general
they're
themes.
Not trying to push that. That's not the angle. Yeah, but they will instead. What is the general theme? I don't know. Being pushed is going to be influenced by the state of the policy debate right now. Is going to be influenced by. Is going to be influenced by how the political winds are blowing. I've noticed how. You'll see, like people will change their tone in discourse. Like, for instance, here's an easy idea, right? Like, if you were to write, we were talking about, just because we were talking about the caliphate earlier, in the wake of ISIS, it's not going to be too popular to write an article about how actually the caliphate isn't that problematic and is something that a lot of Muslims believe in. Okay, you do that, you're going to be painted as like some kind of ISIS supporter or something, and you don't understand how terrible the caliphate is, or blah 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 blah, right? And so there's a kind of cleverness that you need to have in order to navigate these waters. You need to be paying attention to the state of public discourse and trying to figure out how to make the case in a smart way, in a way that's readable, in a way that's presentable, in a way that is accessible and convincing, right? And if you wanted to argue this point that, just in the example I just gave, it would be difficult and would take some time, and you would really have to think how to frame that argument. Right. Yeah. And oftentimes it's a question of hikmah. Is that really the conversation you want to bring up right now? Is it really the most important thing, facing Muslims today? No. Right. I mean, and this is, I think, we just need to have more strategy rather, in terms of how you think about issues. You need to see, like, what are the concerns of the American people right now with regards to the Muslim world or Islam or whatever the case might be. Let's speak to those concerns, right? And let's kind of cool the waters a little bit before we jump to things like, don't write an op-ed talking about how, like, the HUD punishments are real or something. It's not going to go down, right? You're dumb at that point,
Mahin wants the HUD punishments back. He quickly wants to get his sin over with and get that punishment done with. and move on.
I actually have a preference. My personal favorite is the firing squad. I've always said that. The firing squad is pretty. Well, that's not really. I
don't think that's part of Islamic hot punishment. I think those are.
Might as well
I think those are American hot punishments.
Yeah, but you can take the benefit from the other countries too. You know. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I don't know if they still use that or not.
Leave the dead.
You know, but Rashid, I think we need to get a book list. I think when Sim comes through and edits the show, that's like write every book you recommended and put it on the show notes, because that's always like we don't read enough, man, and I think that's something we want to do. But I think Sim's got to go play Maghrib. I'm traveling because I follow the Maliki opinion that 27.2 miles, and every time I come out here, it's like traveling, dude. I'm good. 2 Rakat Isha. So, Rashid, again, Jazakallah khair for coming through. Really appreciate it. Really got a lot of food for thought for us.
And next time you're in Chicago, hit us up.
Yeah.
Because I know you're a native too here, so.
Yeah, we got to take you to this Chinese. There's a Chinese halal place right next to Sim's place that last time you were hanging out with us, we had some wing zone. But how can people find out more about you? Like, where can they engage with you? If you have any social media contacts or anything like that?
So I think that, I don't use Facebook as much or Instagram anymore. The best place to find me is Twitter. So it's just my first name, last name, RASHIDDAR, one word, nothing else. You should find me there. You can send me a DM or, just follow me or whatever. And would love to engage further. And I guess lastly, I wanted to say that, a lot of the times, a lot of the topics we talked about were about history, about hypothetical situations. They're rather abstract. I don't want people to get the impression that, I'm some kind of like closet like ISIS, or I'm trying to make a justification for this and that. This is something that unfortunately Muslims have to say now, right? But it's just to have a kind of rational conversation about things.
Yeah.
It's just what I want to do when I ask these questions, to broach a conversation that I think Muslims don't have enough within their own communities. And, I am not sitting here saying that I have the authoritative knowledge as to how Muslims should operate their communities politically. I don't. I see that as an ongoing conversation. And I've written before that I actually think that Muslims themselves don't really have a clear idea, because they're actually engaged in an ongoing dialogue and a dialectic with other ideologies of the day today. And they still are trying to articulate what it means to govern and to live by and to have a society that's understood through Islam as it's revealed, as a revealed religion. And that's a conversation that will be ongoing. I don't necessarily, the reason I like studying this stuff is because it's just the plethora of opinion out there is just, we're in such it's like the Wild West when it comes to politics. Like no faqih can really tell you how things should ultimately be in this day and age right now. Everyone has a different stance. Some people are like pro-revolution, some people are anti-revolution, some people are this or that. I mean, you can find people spouting off every which point of view. And so in that sense, I like to think that my intention when I went into this was that I wanted to just learn more, and I'm still learning, and I'm still formulating my views in consultation with scholars and people of knowledge who understand this tradition better. So if I said anything wrong, please forgive me. It's from myself. And if I said anything correct, it's from Allah. And
all right, Jazakallah khair, Rashid, for coming through. For our listeners out there, if you have any questions or comments, you can contact us at themadmamluks@gmail.com. You can like our Facebook page. You guys, we need more Facebook likes. I mean, people reach out to us, like, we love your show. Like us on Facebook, share our stuff. Leave us a 5-star review on iTunes if you really want to support us. And then follow us on Twitter, and we are also on Instagram. For our special guest, Rashid Dar, and for my co-host, Sim, this is Mahin signing off for the Mad Mamluks. Assalamu alaikum.